The moment you think you transcended your ego, it's already found a new way in. You have that breakthrough, that awakening experience where everything feels clear. The old patterns seem to be gone, but then they come back, wearing different clothes. You start measuring how long you meditate compared to others. You search for the best teacher, the perfect spiritual community. What if chasing spiritual growth becomes just another trap? What if your ego just switches from wanting money and status to wanting enlightenment and spiritual experiences? Today we are exploring how the ego sneaks back in after awakening, why it hides behind spiritual identities, and how simple awareness can set you free. Before we continue, if you're ready to break free from the repeating patterns that hold you back, check out my free guide, 5 inner blocks that keep you from deep spiritual growth. The link is waiting for you in the top comment below. Here is what most people miss about spiritual awakening. The ego doesn't disappear, it shapeshifts. It may seem like a master of disguise who changes outfits but remains the same person underneath. The common misunderstanding is treating the ego like a cunning, separate persona that's actively working against you. The ego isn't a villain with its own agenda. It's simply a collection of unconscious thought patterns, beliefs, and conditioning that defaults to familiar strategies when triggered. But here's what's really happening. Each morning you wake up as someone slightly different than yesterday. Your experiences change you. Your spiritual growth changes you. As you evolve, your sense of self evolves too. Since your ego is really just thoughts about who you are, it evolves along with you. It's not trying to trick you, it's just keeping up with who you have become in your mind. After spiritual awakening, you may think you have left the ego behind, but these old patterns notice the game has changed. You are no longer impressed by fancy cars or job titles. So the patterns adapt. They move into your spiritual life instead. The spiritual ego emerges in a new form. This version has learned to speak awakening language. It wants to find your twin flame instead of just any partner. It obsesses over eating perfectly instead of making money. It finds the urge to heal others instead of buying things. Nothing wrong with these pursuits themselves. The problem is what's driving them. Dig deeper and you find the same old fears running the show. Fear of being alone becomes seeking your twin flame. Fear of death becomes obsessing over what you eat. Fear of being worthless becomes needing to heal everyone else. Your awakening created new space, like a bulldozer that cleared huge chunks of old patterns. You felt free, blissful, connected. But awakening rarely pulls up all the roots. It just clears enough space for you to start the real work. Then life happens. Money problems, relationship drama, health scares. Suddenly that bliss disappears. You crash back into fear. What happened? The awakening may have cleared the surface stuff, but the deep roots are still there. When those core fears get triggered, the ego doesn't just put up the same old walls, it decorates them with spiritual themes. Money fears become abundance affirmations. Relationship fears become divine timing. Health fears become purification practices. Instead of feeling the fear, you look for spiritual methods to escape it. The ego uses this chance to rebuild itself, only now with spiritual overtones. You might find yourself avoiding situations that could trigger these fears. Any path that might lead toward uncertainty gets labeled as not aligned or low vibration. The ego creates new walls, just decorated with different posters. When you once had motivation quotes, you now have spiritual mantras. But the function remains the same: protection from the rawness of life. The key is recognition without reaction. You can learn to spot the ego's fingerprints without falling into its stories. When you notice yourself comparing your meditation practice to others, that's the ego. When you feel superior because you eat organic food, that's the ego. When you judge others as unawakened, that's definitely the ego. But here's what changes everything. You don't need to fight these patterns. Fighting the ego keeps you trapped in its game. Instead, you observe with neutral curiosity. You see the pattern without becoming it. The ego wants to survive. It will find whatever identity that feels safest in the moment. Sometimes it's the wise spiritual teacher. Sometimes it's the wounded healer. Sometimes it's the enlightened being who has transcended all human concerns. These are all just costumes. Real growth happens when you stop trying to be anybody in particular. When you can rest in not knowing, not being, not having any fixed identity to defend. This terrifies the ego because it means it's death. But it's not your death. It's the death of what was never real in the first place. Real freedom comes from being nobody special. Nobody special who can be anyone the moment needs. This might sound like avoiding reality, but it's the opposite. When you're not protecting some image of yourself, you can respond to whatever life throws at you. Fighting the ego versus just watching it is the difference between being trapped and being free. Fighting creates resistance. The ego loves resistance because it proves the ego is real and important. When you fight your ego in its spiritual disguise, you are still playing its game. You're still making it the star of the show. Simple awareness works differently. You notice the ego's patterns like you might notice clouds passing by. No judgment, no rush to make them disappear. You just see what's happening without becoming it. When you catch yourself looking for approval about your spiritual insights, you don't beat yourself up. You just notice with gentle curiosity. Oh, There's the mind wanting approval again. When you catch yourself judging someone as less awake, you don't make yourself wrong. You just notice the judgment and let it move through. This is why trying to kill ego keeps you trapped in the very game it wants you to play. The ego doesn't care whether you love it or hate it. It just wants your attention. It wants to be the main character in your inner drama. When you try to eliminate it, you're still making it the star of the show. The ego thrives on your reactions. Every time you get upset about having egoic thoughts, you feed its survival. Every time you celebrate transcending ego, you've just created a new ego identity, the person who transcends ego. What if there's nothing to transcend? What if this whole project of becoming more evolved, more awake, more spiritual is just another ego game? This can be scary because it tears down the whole framework most people use for growth. Letting go of the need to have all the answers instead of creating new beliefs for safety takes real courage. The mind wants certainty. It wants to know what's happening, why it's happening, and what to do about it. But life is uncertain. No belief system can change that. When you stop creating new spiritual beliefs for safety, you're in unknown territory. You can't predict how you'll respond because you're not operating from some fixed idea of yourself anymore. This terrifies the ego, but frees who you really are. Not reacting doesn't mean becoming passive or checked out. It means letting triggers show you what still needs attention without rushing to fix anything. When fear comes up, instead of grabbing your spiritual tools to make it disappear, you stay present with what's actually happening. This is where real change happens. Not when you try to fix, but when you stay aware. Not when you heal, but when you stay open while everything in you wants to shut down. The trigger isn't your enemy. It's showing you where you're still unconscious. You integrate instead of trying to eliminate. You use ego as information, not identity. When you get possessive about your spiritual experiences, you don't try to become more generous. You look at what the possessiveness is protecting. When spiritual pride shows up, you don't try to become more humble. You see what the pride is defending. The ego becomes a teacher instead of an enemy. Its patterns show you exactly where you're not free yet. But you're not trying to complete anything. You're just aware of what's happening without needing it to change. This awareness changes everything. Not because you're doing anything, but because awareness is the space where change happens naturally. Before we wrap up, if you found this helpful and want to go deeper, remember that free download I mentioned, 5 inner blocks that keep you from deep spiritual growth. The link is waiting for you in the top comment below. You were never broken, just temporarily identified with thoughts. The ego that seems so solid, so persistent, it's just a collection of mental patterns with no substance beyond the attention you give them. Freedom lives in the space between trigger and reaction. The entire spiritual journey is simply choosing awareness over the story your mind keeps telling you.